Dissociation is one of the harder things to talk about without dissociating, or causing the people who are most in a position to know what you're talking about to dissociate. A lot of them are doing it right now, even though they thought they were going to watch and really take in this video. But instead, they're going to remember a vague notion of it and none of the specific words. I know because it's something I fight against all the time. I spent a bulk of my teenage years and my 20s trying to get to the heart of what was going on inside my head, studying psychological terminology on the internet, analyzing people from the sweet comfort of my desk chair, with no involvement whatsoever in the scholarly field of psychology. I saw a therapist for a while when I was 20, but he died by crashing a plane a couple of years later, and I haven't been to another professional since, so bear with me. But the conclusion that allowed me to start actually doing something about myself and turning my life around was to diagnose myself with and start trying to self-treat for dissociative derealization disorder. Have you ever felt like there's multiple versions of yourself that don't really have a say in the way that one another behave? Or like the stuff that you do and say is so disconnected from the way that you think that it doesn't register as being stuff you did? A lot of the feelings that I associate with dissociation are relatively commonplace in small doses, in the same way that a lot of people can relate to the broad symptoms of autism or obsessive compulsive disorder, but they find their lives unaffected by it in the way that people who are actually diagnosable with autism or OCD are affected. I've met people way more distant than myself, and also people who remind me of the way that I used to be, and who offer a lens to me into how I must have looked to other people before I recognized the disconnect within myself. I'm not even trying to say that I come off as normal now or something, but only that I understand what's going on with me enough to account for it and how I respond to and deal with other people. Now we're getting dangerously afield of this resembling an anime video, and also dangerously afield of being relatable to anybody anymore. So let's reel off some names of characters with the same kind of disconnected disposition that you might experience from a person like myself in rapid succession. Iwakura Lain, Ryogi Shiki, Shina Mayuri, Kiriyama Rei, Ikari Shinji, Spike Spiegel, Miyashita Toka, Himemiya Ansi, Kirigoe Mima, and I'm sure I could think of more, but I'll focus in on these for now in order to rein in the scope of this video. If you can personally relate to multiples of these characters, or at least know who some of them are, there's a better chance that you'll get what I'm on about here. Kara no Kyoukai is the only anime series I've seen which presents dissociative identity disorder in one of its main characters with any kind of seriousness, even if the premise is also very edgy and very anime. Ryogi Shiki has the mystic eyes of death perception, which allows her to understand how to kill literally anything, just by cutting along certain lines. After traumatic events from her childhood, her personality ended up being split between a male and a female driving persona, the differences between which can only really be identified by somebody who's making an effort to identify one from the other through persistent interactions, meaning that by the end of the anime series, pretty much only her boyfriend Mikia really seems to have a grasp on who's who in Shiki's head, and even then, only after a third personality's nearly incomprehensible introduction in the epilogue film. Shiki is on the extreme end of what I'm going to call the spectrum of dissociation. Her identity that seems to have the most literal control of her body, but which shows itself to other people the least, is completely unknown to the other two, in a situation that's similar to what was revealed at the end of the first season of Disney Plus's Moon Knight adaptation. Her feminine personality is mostly boring, and her masculine personality is mostly a hard ass, and neither one of them is a conversationalist. Shiki spends most of their time wandering liminal spaces and looking for spooky dudes to beat up. All of their personalities have a strong relationship with Mikia by the series' end, and so there is a kind of unity within their intent that seems more satisfying than the relative discord and lack of personal identity that they exhibited earlier in the jumbled timeline of the series. In a sense, Kara no Kyoukai is a story about healing however you can, even if the pieces will never fit exactly the same way as they did before they fell away. Miyashita Toka from Boogiepop is a more conventional case of dissociative identity disorder, as identified within the text of Boogiepop and Others, even if one of her identities is anything but ordinary. Toka herself is by all accounts a completely average high school student, whose self-awareness about sharing her body with the Boogiepop identity is questionable, at least within the early stories of the series that have been translated to English through official channels so far. Meanwhile, the phantasmal Boogiepop personality bubbles to the surface whenever it senses a supernatural threat that it knows it can hunt down instinctively. Considering the supernatural, Lovecraftian science behind the events of the story's plot, it's likely that the break which created Boogiepop was as supernatural as it was psychological, but the way that Miyashita Toka's boyfriend learns to deal with the presence of Boogiepop inside of his girlfriend is the first story that gets told within the jumbled continuity of Boogiepop and Others, and feels very down to earth as just the tale of a guy dealing with the fact that his girlfriend's got two personalities. You'll notice already a theme of broken continuity in dissociative stories, which I think is intentional. Spike Spiegel said once that one of his eyes is always looking at the past while the other stays in the present. When he isn't on call, Spike spends most of his time legit just zoning out and smoking cigarettes on his ship, thinking about where it all went wrong. Spike can't cope with the decisions that he's made or the losses that he's incurred because of his mistakes, and so he's left without a sense of motivation to move on with life beyond basic survival. Only when his past catches up with him does he realize the way forward in an heroic suicide run. Sheena Mayuri from Steins Gate is hard to pin down because we know in part that her personality and behavior is the product of trauma suffered after the death of her grandmother, but we also could assume that she always would have been kind of a strange person. There's an aspect of arrested development, as if she hasn't let go of any of the behaviors that she had at the time before the trauma, because part of her is still stuck back in that place. But she also exhibits emotional understanding that shows some perspective which could only be gained through growing up and through trying to understand people. She can seem naive and innocent sometimes, but it's usually more that she doesn't want to put up a fight, and she's willing to compromise on her abuse at the hands of the likes of Okabe in order to make both of them happy. Mayuri ends up being kind of the heart of Steins Gate's morality, but sadly she never really gets explored enough to really get a sense of the way that her mind works like you might do with Shiki or with Spike. Oddly enough, I think that Ikari Shinji at his best is a lot like Sheena Mayuri, even if we only see glimpses of him getting to be in the kind of environment where he feels comfortable enough to open up and show compassion in the way that she gets to for a lot of the story. Shinji really is the sweetest of soft boys who wants nothing more than to find a way to bring peace and happiness to people, if only it didn't require excruciating physical and mental suffering on his part to achieve. A lot of attrition has been put on Shinji both inside the show and out for refusing to suffer for the sake of humanity, for the sake of a humanity that mostly treats him like dog shit to begin with. But when Shinji goes housewife mode and cleans your whole apartment, makes you dinner, and puts up with your drunken antics, you should realize that he's actually better than most of us. Just give him a little space every now and then to go wandering off in the mountains and drift among the mists. Kiriyama Rei from March Comes In Like a Lion has always felt to me like a Shinji type just a few years further down the line, and if the thing that his dad had gotten him into before disappearing from his life was something more normal than piloting robots. Rei is a prodigious shogi player and spends a lot of his time swimming through his feelings in his past as he tries to maintain a sense of self and presence in what has become a relatively abnormal life. The circumstances of his career and his upbringing have made it difficult for him to understand and relate to most other people or to find a place for them in his life. But luckily, the amazing people that he ends up finding himself surrounded with bring him into the world of human relationships and start creating that sense of purpose within him that leaves him with less time to wallow alone in his feelings. As I describe these characters one after another, the common thread that I see in them is a sense of enclosure from the past, a lacking ability to maintain a full sense of presence in the present thanks to constantly recounting what's already been seen. Whether they are stuck in feelings of abandonment and loss like Shinji, Rei, and Mayuri, or they're haunted by their own nature and the decisions that they made in the past like Spike and Shiki, there's always a sense that the inability to move on from an idea or a memory has kept a part of these characters' minds in a loop that somehow can't account for the perspective gained and the present circumstances of the situation surrounding them. And I can't really get much deep into it, but I'm pretty sure this is what the whole story of Umineko no Naku Koro ni and Higurashi no Naku no Koro ni are about. Perfect Blue allows us to watch the process of trauma and dissociation take place in real time, as Kirigoe Mima experiences the worst stretch of her life with a murderous stalker killing all of the people around her. Mima starts the film as a pop idol, and there's already a sense that the relationship she has with the audience and the media has started to draw her out of the pure thrill of performance and more into her own head. She wants to move into a career path that will see her as a serious adult and challenge herself, develop her skills, and work through the seedy industry machine, even if she has to do some unsavory thing. But as the stress compounds from the expectations of the work and the unreasonable circumstances surrounding her, she starts to lose grip with reality and slip away into these delusions that leave her questioning her own identity and her actions, to the point that she starts thinking maybe she's the killer, up until a thrilling conclusion that finally makes things clear enough for her to move on. I have to wonder if drawing on that feeling of broken reality is what allows Mima to become a successful actress after the dust has settled. Or was this just the way that she already was, and this situation made it that much worse? Iwakura Lain is the patron saint of dissociation, derealization, and schizophrenia in animation. I don't think another story has gone nearly as far out of its way to represent these experiences or to explore them thematically in the story as this one has, and it may just be through the virtue of the show's laser focus on Lain as a character that she feels richer and more relatable than any of the other ones that I've talked about so far. At the start of the series, Lain is already presented as the kind of person to just kind of lay around and forget that she exists for most of the time, easily lost in the buzz of the constant white noise from the bustle of Tokyo and struggling to cling to a sense of presence, often drifting into full-on hallucinations instead of being able to pay attention to anything. When Lain is invited to transplant her soul into the internet by a recently suicided classmate, she becomes obsessed with computers and communications technology and rapidly finds her way into anonymous hacker groups and illegal parts trading as a means of chasing the deepest understanding of the internet that she can. In order to interface with the net effectively, she develops a persona that is so divorced from her natural self that, in events where she has to embody that persona to meet with people in real life, it becomes the subject of conversation that she looks exactly like this other person but seems completely disconnected from them. Eventually, her reputation goes so far beyond her that it is commandeered and used against her, causing even deeper psychological fractures which leave her unable to tell who she actually is and what she's actually done. At the other end of understanding the way that her identity has gotten away from herself, she chooses to erase her identity from the world entirely. The difference between the way that I behave naturally in most circumstances and the persona that I took on in order to create an internet career as a person called Digibro are exactly as stark as the different versions of Lain, and eventually it became just as difficult for me to account for that difference. I had to erase Digibro from my life and kill him in a cultural sense in order to personally escape the confusion created by trying to embody a persona so different from my own self-perception so often for so many years. Unlike Lain, however, my life continues after the framework of my identity crisis has been torn down around me. Although I think Lain is more deeply explored by her show, the character that I relate to best and like the most in this discussion is Himemiya Anthy from Revolutionary Girl Utena. Anthy is about as impenetrably out of it and multifarious as Lain is, but she does all of her stuff in the background of the anime series Revolutionary Girl Utena, and we only really learn what her deal is at the very end of the show, in a way that makes her a lot easier to understand when you go back and watch it all again. Which can also be said about Lain, but that show is also a third of Utena's length, which makes rewatching it a lot easier, and the show is focused almost entirely around Lain personally, whereas Anthy is kind of in the background of Utena's episodes, even though she's at the heart of the entire story. Without spoiling too much of Utena's story, Anthy is every bit as traumatized and as trapped in the past as any of the other characters that I've talked about, but she's situated more similarly to Lain or Mima within her story, in that she is still being subject to her suffering and trauma in the narrative present, and doesn't even really have the reason for her situation explained to the viewer until near the end of the show, leaving the depth of her real suffering as a late-term reveal. Even still, it is enough to understand that Anthy is a complete slave to circumstances, essentially trying her best to keep a smile and keep her situation as funny and comfortable as she can, even though it's fundamentally a situation of physical and spiritual imprisonment. In order to function inside of the system wherein she feels completely trapped, she locks away all of her real emotions and reactions as deep on the inside as she can, and projects out various personas that allow her to bounce off of the interactions with others as effectively as possible and preserve the secrets of the people holding her chains. Anthe is special to me because her trauma isn't just something that happened to her or which she did to herself in the past, but something that's happening right now and she herself is actively doing over the course of the whole series. It's kind of excruciating the more I've seen the show to really process what this is all like from her perspective, knowing all the shit that she's just letting slide and staying quiet about so she doesn't make things worse for herself and everyone else in her situation. Dissociation isn't something that only gets triggered with Anthe, like how Mayuri sometimes just stops and put her hands to the sky, or how Boogiepop bubbles up phantasmally, or how Shinji just spaces out in the middle of conversation from thinking too much. Anthe is dissociating on purpose as a tool to get through daily interaction and to cope with her situation. When I was closer to the ages of characters like Shinji, Lain, and Shiki, I felt and behaved more similarly to them. And since we never get to see these characters grow up in the context of their own stories, it's hard to imagine how they might have changed or learned to cope going forward. Sangatsu no Lion is a show about learning how to cope and to grow in that very sense, and I think that Anthe is a character who kind of understands what she should be doing or what the world is supposed to be like, but just feels so trapped by circumstances that she can't change the way things are until she's inspired by Utena, who just won't accept circumstances the way they are. I think I have made more progress than any of these characters have in my age and in my challenging circumstances again and again, and I'm not sure if I know of an anime series about a character who has learned to become more associative and to cope with their feelings and traumas as they grow older, besides these. If you know any good examples, or you know more about dissociated anime characters, or you relate to the ones that I just talked about in your own ways, let me know about it in the comments below. And always remember to never forget, anime forever.